Just to begin and just to frame what I'm going to say, I just want to reference a distinction made by Paul Ricoeur in a paper that was published in 1974 on philosophy and religious language, where Ricoeur contrasts the systematic formulations found in manuals of theology with religious expression in modes of discourse such as narratives, prophecies, legislative texts, proverbs, and liturgical formulae. And it's in this latter genre or grouping of types of works that I'm interested, and in the theological potential of reading, say, works of literature and poetry even, that I think Ricoeur has helpfully contrasted with, say, systematic theology as two potentially productive ways of looking at theology. The study of the sort of intersection between theology and literature is something which has gathered some momentum in the 20th century. I would say there has been some important work done by Nathan Scott in the US, and he set up a program at Chicago University called Literature and Theology. There's a PhD program that still runs to this day. More sort of coming back towards the time period that I'm concerned with, there's also recently been a volume done on Dante, which is titled Dante, Theology as Poetry. No prizes for guessing the inspiration for my talk title. And that again is something I'm hoping to look into in much greater detail, and is seeking to really look at some of the same questions that I'm interested in with respect to the intersection between theology and literature, again in a medieval figure. I will mention that again towards the end. From the Islamic perspective, there has been less, I would say, in this nascent field. There have been some works. There's been a good study by Cyrus Ali Zargar on ethical storytelling in Islam, and specifically with respect to Rumi, that whilst there has been a substantial amount of scholarship on Rumi by now, there is still not a great deal on his looking at his theology and the way in which that intersects with his narrative poetry, although there have been a couple of promising attempts to do that. So really this is just the framing of what I'm going to speak about today, and again, I don't want to get too tied down or caught up in terminologies. I don't mean something here very specific or technical by theology. I just mean because obviously we're translating terms across traditions, and there's lots of one can go into the question of what do you mean by theology, and which discipline are you looking at, and so on. But really, I'm just generally speaking about attempts to conceptualize or speak of God, and occasionally that does link to formal discourses of theology. And I'm doing that with reference to the narrative poetry of Jalaluddin Rumi as found in his Masnavi, which I will introduce very shortly. Okay. Just one note for those of you from what once was called an Oriental Studies background, which is no longer politically correct. We recently changed the name here in Oxford, so to Middle Eastern Studies. So those of you from that particular background will excuse the lack of diacritics in this presentation. It is because I'm not using my own laptop due to some technical reasons, and I wasn't able to configure the correct software. So it is all diacritic free, and I know to some people that can be quite traumatic. Okay, so just to briefly set out what I hope to do today, I want to introduce Rumi and his sort of fundamental metaphysical outlook, which I will argue is crucial for understanding the dynamics of narrative in the Masnavi. And specifically, I will speak about the distinction between form and meaning, or surah and ma'ana, which is very pervasive throughout the text. Having set this out, I will then go into a case study of a very well-known story in the Masnavi, which concerns a fictional meeting between Moses and a shepherd, and look into the theological implications, some of the theological implications of that narrative. So, by way of biography, I'm going to assume that some of you may have heard of Rumi, the name Rumi. I mean, he's been now very popularly translated into English, sometimes well, sometimes not. But because of that, he has gained a degree of popularity. And I believe in the US, he's still, by some counts, the best-selling poet in any language. So his work has been very, and interpretations of his work have been very well received. Rumi is a toponym, so it just means Rum is what in the Muslim world would be sort of how they would refer to Anatolia, the region roughly coinciding with Anatolia and west of that. And Rumi, having ended his life in that region, this was a toponym that was ascribed to him. His full name was Jalaluddin Muhammad ibn Muhammad al-Balkhi al-Rumi. And he's more popularly known in the Muslim world. He wouldn't be necessarily referred to as Rumi. More popularly, he will be called Maulana, which means our teacher. And this is how his own students would have referred to him. So he's born in 1207. His family have some association with Balkh in present-day Afghanistan, although according to the most recent scholarship, it's more likely that he was born in a town called Vakhsh, which is present-day Tajikistan. Already we can see that sort of contemporary borders were much more fluid in those times. His family had to leave Vakhsh when he was still a boy for reasons which are not entirely clear, but there's been some speculation. I won't go into that, but what we need to worry about is that he had to leave, and his family eventually passed through many places on their way, including Baghdad, Damascus, and eventually settled in Konya, present-day Turkey. His father was a renowned preacher in the town and a scholar of minor repute. Rumi initially received his education at the hands of his father before going to Damascus to receive his formal religious training, where he would study the important disciplines of Islamic law, Quranic exegesis, and hadith interpretation, and so on. On his return to Konya, he began to teach Islamic law, and he acquired students. He would give the Friday sermon from the pulpit at the Seljuk Mosque, and he also had some spiritual disciples carrying on the mantle from his father. The real transformative event in Rumi's life comes just before he reaches the age of 40. 40 is generally an auspicious age in the Islamic tradition. That's also when the Prophet Muhammad was said to have received his revelation. And Rumi's own sort of revelatory moment was a meeting with a man called Shams of Tabriz, who was, again, a rather enigmatic figure, and somebody who came to be his, it's hard to describe their relationship, but I think probably it suffices to call it a deep spiritual friendship with real mutual respect, love, and a process of learning from one another. And it led to this meeting led to a process of introspection and led Rumi to question some of the public fame that he had accrued by virtue of his position, some of the status that he had acquired by means of his religious knowledge, and it led him on a sort of inward journey that continued long after this meeting, this encounter of these two souls had finished. And this was a very short encounter, which lasted less than 2 years before Shams mysteriously disappeared. And historians have their thoughts and opinions on exactly what happened to him, but we're not quite sure. So, this was, Shams's departure was very important for Rumi and had left an impact on him, and he authored a collection of poems, some while Shams was still there, a collection called the Divan-e-Shams, the collection named after Shams. And Shams appears regularly as a reference in other works. Rumi, in terms of since I've mentioned the Divan-e-Shams, I mean, just quick reference to his published output. He does have, in addition to that Divan, obviously there's the Masnavi, which I'm going to discuss, and he also has some prose works, including a book called Fihi Ma Fihi, which is just a collection of some of his discourses with his students, and then there's also collections of his letters and some of his sermons. So that's the state of what we have. So the Masnavi, the Masnavi and Ma'navi, which is the name of the text, which we might translate as spiritual rhyming couplets, perhaps, or I mean, it's quite difficult to translate. But the Masnavi is just a genre in Persian poetry, consisting of rhymed couplets, and it's most commonly used for epic narratives. And the most famous example is Ferdowsi's Shahnameh, which some people may have come across, which is 11th century collection of pre-Islamic Persian epics, and it's sort of very crucial to the formation of a Persian identity, Iranian identity. But that's like one of the most famous examples of a Masnavi. And then later on, it's also extensively used in sort of mystical didactic verse by people like Sana'i, who's an inspiration of Rumi's, and Fariduddin al-Attar, who's another one of Rumi's inspirations. And Rumi's Masnavi is probably, well, it's again one of the best known in that genre. So yes, the Masnavi, in Rumi's Masnavi was composed at the request of one of his students. Sorry, I should just a couple of structural remarks actually about this Rumi's Masnavi. So it's divided into 6 volumes, a total of about 26,000 verses. And it was composed at the request of one of his students, Hussam ad-Din, who wanted him to record some of his spiritual teachings in verse. And as the story goes, sort of as they were walking, Hussam ad-Din asked him. Rumi took his hat off and took out the first 18 verses of the Masnavi, the famous, very famous first 18 verses, known as the Name-Nameh, and pulled it out of his hat, as it were. The text contains a multitude of fables, retellings of ancient myths and Quranic stories, famous Sufi stories and anecdotes, alongside the author's own didactic voice coming very strongly through and intervening where necessary. In Persian, yeah, good point. I should have mentioned that, and it's worth saying as well that the students are also very present in the text. So you'll find often reference to Rumi kind of going through essentially a lecture and then saying, you clearly don't understand, or this is above you're not listening, or this is too much for you, and so I'm going to stop now. And so there's a real sort of interplay and a sense in which you feel that this is a text that's been composed or being sort of recited to his disciples, and I think that comes through very strongly in the text. So today, I mean, it's worth saying that even prior to Rumi, storytelling was I alluded to this earlier, but storytelling was an important medium for Sufi teaching. So again, I mentioned the names like Attar and Sana'i, who have these kind of didactic poems, but even figures who aren't primarily poets, like Ghazali and Suhrawardi, they make use of fables and stories in their own works for ethical purposes often. And the book by Cyrus Ali Zargar, which I mentioned, is a good way to overview of this. And the last thing to say about the Masnavi is, even though it's a text composed in Persian, in a context where Persian was whilst not the only language, was one of the most important languages for culture and sort of literature. Today, the Masnavi is popular across the Muslim world, and particularly in the subcontinent, in Turkey, where today Persian is no longer really the primary language of instruction or even a prominent language, but is still very important in those contexts. And you'll find religious gatherings where the Masnavi is taught, the stories from the Masnavi are taught, and so many of the stories, are kind of second nature to lots of people. These stories still live with populations across the Muslim world. So I think that's worth noting.
I might now turn to Ket and just ask clarification. It's very big, 6 volumes, Quran 6,000 verses, Masnavi 20,000 verses.
Yeah.
3 times the size?
4, roughly.
4 times.
Yeah. And actually, that's a good point. I mean, yeah, it helps to kind of recognize the scale of the text. But also, actually, it's worth noting that the Quran is an extremely important part of the Masnavi itself. So a fourth of the verses of the Masnavi contains some kind of allusion or reference, whether explicit or implicit, to the Quran. So you literally can't read more than 10, 15 lines without encountering Quran. So that is something that is quite integral to the text. And people have spoken about kind of Rumi having a Quranized mind. So in the sense that it's sort of so present that it's obviously just something that was part of with him. The Quran, we don't know for sure, but it seems that he either had memorized it or had a kind of a deep enough appreciation that as he's composing poetry, he can't help but just have include Quran within the text.
But it's in translation.
Sometimes no, not always. Sometimes it's there's Arabic. I mean, actually the introduction to the Masnavi, there's a prose introduction in Arabic as well. And then within the even though it's primarily in Persian, there are fragments of, say, Arabic sayings or maybe Quran. Although sometimes he'll also translate, give the sense of a verse, a Quranic verse in Persian. But there is a good deal of Arabic as well. So, okay. But thanks. That's, I think, a helpful clarification to seek. Okay, so I think I just want to now turn to the metaphysical outlook, which I think which is important for the later discussion when we get into the case study. And to begin where Rumi begins in his text, which is the fundamental problem for him of the human condition is alienation from our source, that is God. So the Masnavi starts with the very famous lines, Bishnu az ne chun shikayat mi kunad az judai ha shikayat. Bishnu az ne chun shikayat mi kunad judai ha az hikayat mi kunad. Az judai ha hikayat. Sorry, I've done that about 10 times correctly, and obviously when it's in the moment it goes wrong. But the point being that this is the famous Ney Nameh where he's saying, listen to the reed flute as it complains and tells a tale of separation. So he uses this resonant analogy of the haunting sound of the reed flute being a plaintive cry for the separation that it's endured from the reed bed. And that's an analogy for our separation from our source, which is in this context, God. And so for Rumi, the world is ultimately a place of alienation from God. And the fundamental driving force of our existence is the desire to overcome this alienation and be reunited with God. And so this outlook also informs the key metaphysical dichotomy which Rumi sees everywhere in creation, which is between surah and ma'na, between form and meaning. Both of these terms can be found in Avicenna. I don't want to do too much intellectual history here, but for Avicenna, the surah is sort of the form in a broadly Aristotelian sense of the word, and while the ma'na for Avicenna is a sort of a connotative attribute, something, some non-material implication that we cognize from the form of a thing. So the example he gives is a sheep. When a sheep sees a wolf, it immediately recognizes danger, right? So that is something is an implication of the sort of form of the wolf, and is immediately recognized or imprinted on the sheep. So it's sort of something which Rumi takes these two terms, and I mean his own pairing is the way he uses them as a complementary pair is somewhat of a reframing, although I think it would be interesting to consider the relation between how he uses them and how Avicenna would use those terms, I think as an aside. And it does show that Rumi is plugged into the terminology of, say, philosophy and speculative theology. But the way Rumi uses this pair of terms is as follows. The surah of the thing is the worldly manifestation of the ma'na. So the form is the worldly manifestation of the meaning. The underlying metaphysics is that of a realm of essential atemporal meanings behind a world of transient and worldly forms. So there's a couple of passages from the Masnavi which I have here in translation. I should add, I think here I've mostly just used the translations of Nicholson, again because of all my own translations are on my laptop, which is currently in the purgatory, and hopefully will be revived soon. But I need your prayers. So yeah, these are I think primarily from Nicholson. So know that form springs from meaning, as the lion from the jungle, or as voice and speech from thought. In the first volume of the Masnavi. So form, again, it springs out from meaning, and is something. Kind of a manifestation of the meanings which exist in this other atemporal world of essences. Then again, he says in volume 2 of the Masnavi, know that the outward form passes away, but the world of meaning remains forever. So that's, I think, points to that. There's another bit of the Masnavi where he kind of, the ethical element of that distinction comes out. So he talks about how long will you make love with the shape of the jug, or you could translate it as play love. He's gone from make love. Leave aside the jug's shape, go seek water. So I think you kind of get this is a tension which you'll find flowing and arising from that metaphysics that Rumi is constantly criticizing those who get preoccupied with the form and don't consider the fact that the form is merely a manifestation of these meanings, which is what the real stuff that we should be interested in. And that analogy, I think, speaks to that. So this distinction applies to everything that's found in creation. I mean, it's really pervasive in the Masnavi. He'll talk about speech being mere form. He'll talk about even us being, in a sense, form. But I think it also really speaks to in a theological sense, this relationship between the seen and the unseen and the outward to the inward, which I think is a problem that within Islam, or a problematic that is discussed often with respect to the Sharia or the law. and the relationship, for example, between the just in one context where it's salient, the relationship between, say, the adherence to the formal rules of the Sharia and versus the accompanying internal dynamics that must come along with, adherence to the outward rules of the Sharia. So what I'm trying to say here is this broader distinction, which for Rumi is pervasive, I think has a particular salience when it comes to matters of religious expression, and whether that's to do with the law, the forms of the law, or other issues. There's a striking metaphor in in Masnavi, the third volume, he talks about there's a verse where he talks about how when man has attained union, the intermediary becomes useless, right? So being union with the divine, and so again, those intermediaries for Rumi are all the kind of outward manifestations of religiosity, whether it's adherence to the law, but even quite strikingly the Quran itself. So in the same passage, he goes on to tell there's a very striking metaphor where he talks about the futility of reading a love letter when your beloved is sitting in front of you. And the love letter here is actually, it's clear from the context, he's talking about the Quran. So the idea there is that, yes, the purpose of the Quran is to bring you to God. All right. So if you become fixated on the form, then in some sense you are, to the detriment of acknowledging the presence, the divine presence. Then to some sense you're getting it wrong. In some sense you're getting it wrong. And he sees this, a lot of the conflict in creation, in the Masnavi too. A conflict in creation stems from names when meaning is sought, then peace is achieved, meaning being ma'na. So again, he's talking about going beyond names, forms, and to the ma'na. And for him, that's also something, not being able to do that is a source of conflict in this world. So yeah, I think hopefully that's clear.
So there's a clarification question from Carol, who's online.
Sure.
Just saying, so surah versus mana. Surah means appearance. It's not just the liturgical division of the Quran. I mean, we're all used to surah. This is a different meaning.
No, this is not at all related to that particular use of surah. Here, surah, I should have anticipated that possibility for that confusion. Surah is form, and the kind of genealogy of the term is going back to Ibn Avicenna and the kind of Aristotelian idea of forms. But really, how Rumi is using it is appearance. I mean, that's a good way to put it. The outward appearance, or say, going back to this sort of metaphysical distinction, everything in a way, everything that we encounter in the world, for Rumi, that we encounter sort of in our sensory experience is just the outward, is just the form. So we're kind of operating in a world of forms with this realm of meanings which lies behind it, which isn't directly accessible, say, to your five senses. But yeah, appearance might be a good way to put that. So this, having said that, with respect to this, so this idea that the forms of religion, the outward forms of religion are somehow intermediaries, which are there to facilitate a kind of journey back to the divine. That's not to say that those forms in themselves are worthless, which I think is, we're getting into, I think, this kind of a tension, which I think is very important for Rumi. So in the collection of discourses that I alluded to, Fihi Ma Fihi, he says the form also has tremendous value, for it participates in the essence. Just like nothing can be done without the kernel, nothing can be done without the shell. Rumi is very careful to emphasize that at the same time as speaking about forms as intermediaries, he's still careful to emphasize the necessity of form. And for our existence in the world of alienation, it's only through the worldly forms that we can ascend, back to the divine. He says as well, in a part of the Masnavi, seize upon the outward, even if it flies crookedly. In the end, the outward leads to the inward. So again, the path has to be through the outward, through the form, as sort of imperfect as that may be. In the prose introduction to the 5th book of the Masnavi, he describes the law, the Sharia, like a candle, which shows us the way. And without the candle, we cannot even step foot on the spiritual path. So, the candle provides the light that we need to step onto the path. But of course, we must, actually walk as well. Like we can't just, have a candle light the path and not go anywhere. So I think this is the kind of, so just to bring it back, so what I'm hopefully trying to get across here is that the value of any of the forms is in their capacity to assist us in the journey of the soul back to its source. And this requires, for Rumi, taking the forms seriously in themselves, whilst also being prepared for their ultimate dissolution, as we attain the ma'ani which lie behind them. So I think what part of what I'm trying to get to here is that this capacity to both hold faithfully to the forms whilst being ready to transcend them is crucial to understanding the dynamics of narrative in the Masnavi. And I think that's part of the argument I want to make, based on the case study that I'm going to look at. And I want to do that just by entering into a particular theological, or setting the background by discussing this theological issue, which will pertain directly to the story, which is the issue of divine incomparability, which perhaps we may sort of understand by generally speaking, is the kind of transcendence, immanence issue, approximately. So the Quran has two. Obviously, the Quran in one place, this issue is rooted in the Quran. So in one part of the Quran, we have God being described as laysa kamithlihi shay'un. So there's nothing like unto him, which is obviously emphasizing his incomparability with creation and his transcendence beyond our attempts to pin him down with language of that might be recognizable to us in our day-to-day lives. Whilst at the same time, there are references in the Quran to, for example, the hand, God having hands, the hand of God is above them and so on, and the face of God, for example, and I've given a couple of references there. And this has led to, plenty of theological speculation about how to reconcile those two tensions in, God's sort of incomparability with verses and references that seem to be more, speaking of God in terms comparable to humans. And there have been a range of approaches from metaphorical interpretations of these verses that speak about God's hands and so on, to just merely affirming them without any speculation about what is meant by them. And the kind of two polar polemical ends of the spectrum are tashbih and ta'til, which is tashbih is sort of anthropomorphism, and ta'til is divesting God of his attributes. And these are the two polar accusations which are made of the people on either side. So that's just a very, very brief excursion of that issue. And I think obviously at the core of that issue is whether God is accessible to human language. And in Islam we find both types of approaches, the sort of negative, what we might understand is sort of negative theology and positive theology. I always get the cataphatic and apophatic the wrong way round, so it's going to just stick to plain English. So we have both. We find both approaches in the tradition. But I think, again, part of what I want to say is that I think the narrative in the Masnavi allows us to hold both of those approaches in tension in a way, and that's reflective of a particular kind of approach that you find in Tasawwuf, which in Sufism, which holds to both the positive and the negative elements. And I think this is a good expression of that. Okay. I'm doing better for time than I thought I would be doing. So, okay, so the story that I want to look at is, as I mentioned at the beginning, it centers around a fictional encounter between Moses and a shepherd. This is a very popular and loved story from the Masnavi. Many people would know it, even if they haven't read the Masnavi, would have had it recounted to them. And the general gist of the story is that Moses is on his merry way, and he encounters a ragged shepherd who's talking about somebody he loves very much and saying, oh, how I want to comb your hair and, massage your feet and bring you tea, and, very, very much very doting language. And Moses asks, who are you talking about? And the shepherd says, my God. I'm talking about my God. And Moses then gets very annoyed with him and says, how can you speak of God in these terms? These terms are not appropriate to God. To say that you'll kiss his feet and to comb his hair. This is not what I've sort of brought as a message. So he rebukes the shepherd very, very harshly, and the shepherd, of course, this poor humble shepherd, in the sight of this great prophet, is very it's a stinging rebuke, and so he sort of runs off and very repentant. And then God, in the narrative, God then rebukes Moses and very powerfully tells him off. That's the outline of the story. So let's maybe go into that a bit. Might be nice to read a bit. دید موسی یک شبانی راه به راه که ای او همی گفت ای خدا و ای اله تو کجایی تا شوم من چاکرت چارکت دوزم کنم شان سرت جامعت شویم شپشهایت کشم شیر پیش داورم ای محتشم دستکت بوسم به مالم پایکت وقت خوابم آید بروبم جایکت. So Moses saw a shepherd on the way who was saying, O God, who choosest whom thou wilt, where art thou that I may become thy servant and sew thy shoes and comb thy head, that I may wash thy clothes and kill thy lice and bring milk to thee, O worshipful one, that I may kiss thy little hand and rub thy little foot, and when bedtime comes I may sweep thy little room. So I think, the language there is very clear. This is emphasizing that this is a kind of very humble and simple shepherd whose expression of love is kind of very much sort of very servile. It's about, I want to serve you. I want to do these things, very basic things for you. And I think obviously there's a contrast being created with the figure of Moses, who in Islam is one of the great prophets, who had, after the Prophet Muhammad, had one of the biggest communities and was known to be this very fiery figure, who and for having great strength as well. And I think that's some a feature of the narrative, that there's this contrast being created. And in response to the shepherd, Moses then launches into this real stinging rebuke that kind of gradually builds in intensity, and it just gathers pace, whilst you have the sort of incessant rhyme and meter of the Masnavi kind of adding to it. There's a real spectacle, I think. Oh, what just happened? My PowerPoint has encountered a problem and needs to close. Oh, great. Sorry, just bear with me.
Sign for a question.
Yeah, it's a good time to ask questions, but let's see. Okay. So where was I? Now I've got this bar in the way. Slideshow. Okay, let me just get back to where I was. Right, so I was talking about the kind of effect of this, of the text, and obviously PowerPoint wanted to demonstrate that by being completely overwhelmed. And so this authority then is bolstered, because Moses then, not only is he, launching this rebuke, then he brings, then he brings in the Quran, right, as well. So lam yalid, lam yulad, ura layiq est. That's been, as I copied that over, the Persian is not, it's not correct, but anyway, it only matters for those of you that read Persian. But yeah, lam yulad ura layiq est, walid wa mawlud ra u khaliq est. So he begets not, neither is he begotten. And this is, of course, from Surah 112, verse 4. Lam yalid wa lam yulad wa lam yakun lahu kufuwan ahad. So he begets not, neither is he begotten, is appropriate for him. He is the creator of begetting and being begotten. So again, this verse further emphasizes that, the reality of God's transcendence and radical incomparability and from the created order. And again, reflecting on for the educated reader, this narrative really just appears to be building in one direction, right? With the authority of the prophet, the Quranic authority, the orthodoxy of God's radical transcendence and incomparability being spoken through the mouth of the prophet and bolstered by Quranic proofs is clearly going to triumph over the shepherd's illiterate expression of piety, I think, is what any informed and literate reader would be expecting. However, the flow of the narrative powerfully subverts this expectation when God sides against his prophet and going on to make a series of interventions on humanity's right to speak of God in their own terms. وحی آمد سوی موسی از خدا بندهی ما راز ما کردی جدا تو برای وصل کردن آمدی نه برای فصل کردن آمدی هر کسی را سیرتی نهاده هم هر کسی را اصطلاحی داده ام در حق او مد و در حق تو ذم در حق او شهد و در حق تو سم. Revelation came to Moses from God. You have parted my servant from me. You came to create union, not to sow division. I have fashioned a distinct path for each one. I have given each one their own idiom. What is praise for him, for you is insult. What is honey for him is poison for you. So the last line, what is praise for him, for you is insult, that actually mirrors 10 verses earlier, where part of Moses' critique of the shepherd, where he says to the shepherd, hand and foot are praise for us and insult for God. So to describe God in those terms, whilst it might be good, if you were saying those things to me, it's an insult to God. And here God is picked up, or in the narrative, God is picked up on that and used the same sort of words, but shifted the emphasis to the speaker. So he said, what is praise for him, for you is insult. So now it's, rather than talking about, as Moses was concerned with the language used by the shepherd and its applicability to the intended referent, right? So what is praise for him, for you is insult. Sorry. Well, hand and foot are praise for us, but an insult to God. So that's concerned with, the applicability of that language to the referent. Whereas God's response is shifting the emphasis back to the speaker. So what is praise for him? So when he speaks, what might be construed as praise by me, for you is insult, suggesting perhaps that this is an intervention being made on the purpose of language, or the purpose of speaking about God, right? So it's not to truly encompass the referent, right? It's not to really try and the point isn't that hand and foot are not appropriate to God. The point is that the expression is an act of devotion measured by the sincerity of the soul behind it. And as you know, in this verse, it makes clear then the exact idiom of the expression may vary from person to person. So I think by this sort of the device that's being used here in the text of mirroring something that Moses has said previously, but shifting the emphasis from the referent of the language being God to the source of the language being the shepherd's sort of sincere love, there is something being articulated and said about the nature of language, and a language, which expresses love for God, and how that language should be assessed, not with respect to its referent, but with respect to its source. It's worth noting, again, these verses which follow, من نگردیم پاک از تسبیحشان، پاک هم ایشان شوند و درفشان، ما زبان را نگریم و قال را، ما روان را بنگریم و حال را. I'm not sanctified by their glorifications. It is they who become pure and luminous. We do not look at tongue and speech, we look at the state of the soul. So again, this forms part of the response from God. And I think it's worth noting that God's response here is not in conflict with the ontological gap being presupposed by the idea of a transcendent God, which is what is being articulated by Moses. The shepherd's speech isn't being taken as somehow being an accurate representation of God's nature. The words themselves, as it says here, are not capable of sanctifying God. That's not the point. Yet the discourse, as I've said before, is merely being affirmed as a valid expression of his closeness and the shepherd's own luminosity, which is affirmed in the previous verse when God says, "You have parted my servant from me," implying that a union was there, right? So that is also a statement about the state of the shepherd. And I want to bring this back now to the earlier framing of form and meaning, because for Rumi, human attempts to conceive of God in language would all be part of this world of forms. Moses' mistake was not that he misunderstood the forms, that he got it wrong, that somehow he was wrong about his understanding of theology or his interpretation of the verse 112. The problem is that he was clinging to the forms without appreciating that, again, the point I made earlier, that the forms are themselves intermediaries for the soul's journey back to God, and that he did not consider the forms with relation to the forces compelling the human soul back to its creator. So the attainment of ma'ani through the forms, the attainment of meanings through the forms in that sort of metaphysical schema that I outlined, is a process that is intrinsically tied up to the journey of the soul back to its creator. And this just reinforces an insight that Rumi scholar, deceased Rumi scholar, rest in peace, Franklin Lewis, noticed about how Rumi uses this term ma'ani, the plural, which is that it suggests the real experiential comprehension achieved through self-discipline and purity. So the idea being that the kind of, to get to the real crux of the matter when it's is intrinsically tied up. Real knowing is tied up to being, in a sense. Real knowing is tied to process of spiritual purification and the sort of ascent of the soul back to God. And I think that this journey of the soul and its dynamism is something that's really built into the text and how it communicates these issues. The skillful use of authority and rhetoric to build certain expectations in the informed reader, which are eventually subverted, to my mind, generates an ebb and flow of narrative that models the inner journey which the aspirant must themselves take. And that journey being to hold to the forms, in this case, the conceptualizations of God, which would be appropriate for your own level of learning, whilst also being able to recognize the limitations of those forms, and limitations which are progressively laid bare as the soul continues its vertical ascent to God. Hence, narrative emerges as a crucial didactic tool for Rumi, being a medium perhaps uniquely capable of representing the complex interplay of form and meaning that the aspirant must be prepared to live in their own spiritual lives. I think that it's also worth just reflecting here on the fact that this text is a text that was composed with a group of spiritual aspirants in mind, his disciples. And so their own response to the text and their own sort of journey with the text is just as important to take into consideration as just the words on the page. I'm waiting for time. Yeah, okay. Should be fine. So despite language's limitations, this spiritual journey is not one that can be walked along the path of negative theology alone. We do need to have some positive conception of God in the eyes of Rumi, whether that's articulated in the language of speculative theology or in the ecstatic outpourings of an unschooled shepherd. But I think the story is able to square that alongside the recognition of the limitations of that language, representing Rumi's particular blend of positive and negative theology, which is also expressed in the verses that I have on the slide. این ندانم و آن ندانم بحر چیست تا بگویی آنکه میدانیم کیست نفی بحر ثبت باشد در سخن نفی بگذار و ز ثبت آغاز کن. Why should one say, I don't know this or that, so that you can tell of the one who we know? In speech, negation is used for affirmation. Leave negation behind and begin with affirmation. And just read the English here. Come, leave off saying this is not and that is not. Bring forward the one who is real being. So whilst, again, there is this recognition of the limitations of language, but then at the same time, there's a recognition that purely negative theology isn't enough. There has to be some positive conception. And I think part of what we've just read is an attempt to square the fact that we all need a positive conception of God in order to move along that path, even if we recognize in some way that conception isn't sort of on an accurate or a complete depiction of the reality of the divine. So just to bring this out of the text for a minute, I referenced this volume done on Dante earlier, and I think I want to merely highlight that I think there's some interesting potential for work to be done across traditions to unpack or look at these questions in a broader sense. So there has been some of the initial readings of this volume that I've come across suggest that some of the phenomena that I've spoke about with respect to the Masnavi are part of a wider genre of medieval reflection on God through narrative poetry, which have some recognizable features, even when allowing for the difference in poetic tradition and the formal aspects of the text. For one, it appears that in both texts, what is central is a sort of fusion between negative and positive theology. So there's the quote from the third chapter in the volume that Dante's Commedia appears to be a monument to the belief that the human mind can and should construct a comprehensive picture of the universe, whilst on the other hand, Dante wants to point to the inadequacy of the human being in comprehending God, which I found very resonant with what I've been looking at in the Masnavi. And secondly, both texts appear to be deeply informed by the fact that the value of how we speak of God lies not merely in what we say, but in the ethical nature of the utterances, the love with which they are uttered. So I should be careful. I'm not claiming to have done this comparative work. All I've done is looking at the secondary literature on Dante and just observed some resonances which have excited me and made me encouraged me that the phenomena that I'm encountering in the text that I'm working on perhaps has its parallels in a text situated in a completely different context, which perhaps suggests the possibility of my work contributing to a broader shared discussion for those of us interested in the questions of how we speak of and understand God in the context of our own lives and language. And I think I will end it there. Thank you very much, and I look forward to engaging with your questions.
Thank you.